topic of this panel to a wise and thoughtful friend. He said, do historians have a greater responsibility than, say, plumbers? And I actually had to give that some thought. Historians, it seems to me, have four venues in which we have responsibilities as public intellectuals, in our scholarly work, in professional associations, and as teachers. In the first two capacities, historians, unlike me, who have some expertise about this region, probably do have responsibilities. As to public intellectuals, I wish, and I bet a lot of people here wish, that more historians acted as public intellectuals, but we all know it's hard to do. You don't get rewarded for doing it. It's not what we're trained to do. But in a culture like ours that's characterized by so much anti-intellectualism and misinformation, we surely ought to try, it seems to me. And as teachers, I think we try, all of us, to do this within our area of expertise, sometimes through offering information, but even more importantly, through modeling and encouraging critical thinking. I know that is a very hackneyed phrase, but I don't think it's a hackneyed concept. I think it's one we need. But it's as members of learned societies that I think we begin to have disagreements and have to try to figure out paths. Most of us probably shy away from claims that history teaches us lessons. But surely there are some implications. But even the implications can be cloudy. Probably a lot of people in this room could give a succinct explanation of all the terrible decisions that were taken in the 1920s and the 1940s that led us to where the Israeli-Palestinian situation is today. But that does not mean that we could come up with solutions, or even that a great deal more knowledge than I have could come up with solutions. But again, there is a democratic side to American anti-intellectualism, in the sense that, why are our views more important than those of plumbers? Why shouldn't the Teamsters Union also have a responsibility to issue a statement regarding the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? And we could talk about that. But we're here, I want to say, I believe, because of the BDS campaign. I think that is what has created the stimulus and has forced the media to cover this issue much more, and even to tolerate a bit more criticism of Israel than was really permitted in this country for many decades. But a strange thing happened to the BDS campaign when it came to the United States from other parts of the world, and that is that here the discourse about it has taken place mainly among academics who discuss it exclusively in terms of the scholarly cultural aspects of possible impediments to its change. I think there's just tremendous anxiety among academics that I've observed about the meaning of BDS for intellectual exchange, and very little, if any, discussion about the economic aspects of the boycott that is called for. And for example, in thinking about this, I looked at several global websites about BDS. And on those websites, I noticed that scholars were not prominent at all in the list of supporting organizations. Instead, I saw lists of Israeli businesses that are being boycotted. And I have a list, but I won't trouble you with that. Lists of banks, churches, and other funds that have divested from investments in Israeli businesses. Lists of artists, writers, and sports teams who do not want to travel to Israel. And then lists of trade union federations in more than 10 countries that have signed on to BDS. This is a very different picture of BDS than the one that is usually discussed in meetings like those of historians. Now, there is a rich history of attempts to apply large-scale economic pressure, and that is the history that I do know something about. I remember, as well as have written about, the Great Boycott. It was economic power. It was not moral condemnation that forced corporate agribusiness to negotiate with the United Farm Workers. And it was the economic boycott that apparently contributed to the end of apartheid. These boycotts all shed light, furthermore, on another question that I've heard over and over again in these discussions. Why single out Israel? There are other countries that are equally bad. To the best of my knowledge, in the 1960s, few liberals argued why boycott California grapes when farm workers in India suffered worse. No one then argued why protest apartheid when mayhem in Rwanda was worse. Because I somehow at that time, maybe because of the legacy of the social movements that were stronger then, most people understood that boycotts only work when they are strategically chosen and collectively pronounced. We don't make an impact when we make a moral statement by refusing to shop, say, at Whole Foods because we don't like its management. It may make us feel good, but it doesn't help the people who are exploited. Now, the anxiety and intensity that's been focused on this statements of scholarly societies does sometimes suggest to me that there are many of us who have an exaggerated estimation of our importance as intellectuals.
No.
Scholars. How could that be?
No, how could it be?
But it is also true that much of the anxiety comes from the nearly hysterical rhetoric that comes from the defenders of Israeli policy. And that fact, I think, helps explain what it is that makes this whole discussion different in the United States from the rest of the world. I could be wrong, but to the best of my knowledge, that difference is AIPAC. And there is no other country in the world that has an organization with that kind of money, that kind of ability to punish politicians and other public figures who fail to support Israeli policy carte blanche. And so I'm sometimes wondering if perhaps what I see as our constricted discussion of BDS as something that involves only intellectuals or primarily intellectuals and academics actually reflects the power of AIPAC in this country, because it has so successfully, I think, confined the discourse to issues of this kind of intellectual cultural exchange. So I have two reasons that I worry about that focus. The first one is that even among ourselves, among people I think of as liberals who do have some criticisms of Israeli policy, that even among that group, the debate is often very fearful and very overheated. Now, I am not appealing for politeness or civility. In my graduate class this semester, in the midst of Ferguson, we had some really good discussions about what it meant to call for civility when people were very angry. And I'm not thinking about the rhetoric of AIPAC that tells me that I'm not a good Jew. But I find myself surprised when I confront other critical academics who have internalized fears that seem to me to have no external basis. Just one example of one that I've heard frequently is, doesn't Hamas stand for the destruction of Israel? Well, so what? And furthermore, I learned from Rashid Khalidi that there are many different statements that come out of Hamas, and some of them do not toe that line about how Israel should seek to exist. But seriously, as scholars of the world, no person who cares about evidence could possibly argue that there's a threat to the existence of the most powerful state in the Middle East, whose ally is the most powerful state in the world. It may be that what's troublesome about this particular struggle, and again, I'm thinking generationally about my experiences during the Vietnam War, when many people on my side could support the National Liberation Front. Whereas in this situation, we have terrible leadership on both sides, as far as I'm concerned. But to recognize the wrongs of both sides does not require tolerating the real atrocities of the other side. Furthermore, can anyone really fear that intellectual exchange would be cut off by BDS? BDS has no enforcement mechanism. It has no central committee that is going to punish people who do what they want. The only people who suffer from those kind of restrictions are Palestinians, as Nina has just pointed out. And they suffer from them because only the United States and Israel have the power to impose those kinds of restrictions. Furthermore, as I've learned, BDS supporters constitute a decentralized movement with a variety of understandings of how they want to carry out their BDNS. Remember the Women's Liberation Movement. It was the largest and most influential movement in American history. It had just a dizzying variety of disagreements within it, and it still made an enormous impact on this society. Personally, I'm not a supporter of a scholarly boycott, but I do think that those of us who are critical of the Israeli occupation should quit attacking BDS in the often overheated and hyperbolic terms that I hear when people are making their points. It's perfectly honorable, it seems to me, to differ with the strategy, but at the same time to recognize its contributions. And I would offer a historical analogy here. One of the most consequential decisions of the anti-Vietnam War movement was taken by SDS, Students for Democratic Society, at its outset in 1962, I believe. That SDS, you should bear in mind, was quintessentially a new left movement, and it was named that because it detested the old left, namely the Communist Party, and the repressive regimes to which the Communist Party was loyal. But in 1962, SDS decided that it would not ban communists, and it would not engage in red-baiting communists, even though these conditions were demanded of it by its parent organization, the League for Industrial Democracy, because it was determined to reject the McCarthyist hysteria that had so stultified a generation, and I don't need to talk to you about that. I think there's a very useful parallel here in which it is possible to speak quite respectfully and to acknowledge the contributions of a strategy that one doesn't agree with. But the second reason that it worries me is because it keeps us from emphasizing, instead of intellectual exchange, the far more consequential matters of capital. This is, of course, where the power lies, and this is where Europeans have actually made substantial contributions in their attempts, so far not successful, but nevertheless, to try to force Israel to change its policies. I have a list here, and I would just read just some of these things because I think Americans don't hear about this a lot. And most of this comes from the Israeli press. The international boycott of products from the settlements in the West Bank has already caused great losses to the Israeli economy. Business people are demanding government aid to businesses that have been hurt by the boycotts. We all know that SodaStream was forced to close its West Bank factory. Other settlement exports whose worth totals about $90 million are now threatened. The Dutch largest pension fund management company has withdrawn all its investments from Israel's 5 largest banks. Similar withdrawals are considered likely across Europe. Yossi Mekelberg of the British Royal Institute of International Affairs points out that even Germany, usually cautious in such matters, made it clear, this is a quote, made it clear to Israel that grants for Israeli high-tech companies and the renewal of a scientific cooperation agreement depends on the exclusion of any entities that have connections in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. The EU-Israeli Scientific Cooperation Agreement contained the same strictures. The list is much longer. But I also did a very quick piece of research, because I thought, being the U.S. historian on the panel, that was my job, about this country's responsibility in Israel. It turns out that the amount of aid that the U.S. gives to Israel is typically underestimated because it is actually a very complex array of different programs, some of them that I probably could not find out about, but others that are not usually totaled into one thing. We know that we spent $3.1 billion in 2013 on direct military aid. This is a quarter of the Israeli military budget. This is just the beginning. This does not include, quote, joint defense projects for which the U.S. spent cumulatively $8.5 billion through fiscal 2011. It does not include another $504 million for Iron Dome and 2 other projects with these kind of names. One is called David Sling, and the other is called Arrow, no, there were 2, Arrow 2 and Arrow 3. For fiscal 2015, everyone assumes that this spending is going to grow. In addition, Israel held $3.8 billion in U.S. loan guarantees in 2013. And our tax expenditures, for those not familiar with it, a tax expenditure is the taxes that we do not get because tax-exempt organizations spend the money. The tax expenditures amount to untold tens of billions. Then, there's an emergency stockpile of U.S. military equipment maintained in and for Israel, valued at $1.2 billion. The U.S. then contributes refugee and migration assistance to help new settlers in Israel, including those going to the settlements. And then the last thing I'll mention, and I'm not kidding, this was really moving away, there's $2.7 billion that Israel has earned in interest on previous U.S. aid. Israel has 0.001 of the world's population. It receives 1/3 of American aid. Much of this, of course, is non-military, but even the non-military part goes to help maintain the society and the culture and the politics that support the occupation of Palestinian land, and it includes the kind of thing that Nina was talking about, closing universities, suppressing the freedom and access of Palestinian scholars all over the world. And so I think my concern is that by emphasizing so much the scholarly and intellectual exchange, we are missing another kind of responsibility that those of us who do live in the United States have, and that is the responsibility to try to find ways to bring pressure on the American government about its support. And since that support definitely includes various kinds of intellectual and educational restrictions, it seems to me to be entirely appropriate for a scholarly society like ours to be concerned with it. Thank you.